Constantinople has always been an edge, the Roman Empire's outpost to the north, Europe's outpost to the east, Islam's outpost to the west. The city and its harbor became the connector, the welcomer of travelers, refugees, and exiles, a spot for a temporary rest and a transition point before the journeys. 100 years ago, our ancestors in the first wave of Russian immigration left Russian territory and came here fleeing the 1917 revolution and the civil war that followed it. But they never abandoned being Russian or continuing to develop Russian thought, creativity, the pursuit of an independent and free Russia abroad, while believing in their continuing relevance to the future of Russia and their eventual return to their liberated country. In 2022, a new wave of Russian immigration has arrived to the familiar exit points of 100 years ago, facing hauntingly similar concerns of deracination, irrelevance, loss, the same choices of assimilation, or facing a life from suitcases, and the creation of a new, free Russia in the pursuit of molding their new identity, spatially displaced, yet united by circumstance, language, and purpose. Today, we will examine the first wave's first stop on their century-long, multi-generation journey. It was a short, 3-year stop, 1921 to 1923, but it was formative in the collective decision to stay united as Russians and resist a common enemy. We will review how and why this process, extremely rare in historical record at this scale, started and developed, and we will preview its longevity and effect. Dear friends, welcome to the resumption of the Russian Ability Association's lecture series that has been brought to a stop by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, now choosing subjects relevant to our understanding of the roots of the present crisis. I am Alexander Neratov, or Alexander Neratov, pronounced correctly in Russian, Vice President of the Association. With us today are two distinguished scholars who have been working on this period in history 100 years ago, and a group of panelists, some of whom, actually both of whom, have left Russia recently after February 2022. I'm happy to reintroduce our dear friend, Dr. Anatoly Shmylyov of the Hoover Institute, and to welcome our new colleague, Timur Saitov of SUNY Binghamton. Dr. Anatoly Shmylyov is the Robert Conquest Curator for Russia and Eurasia and Research Fellow at the Hoover Institution, Stanford University, and Project Archivist for the Radio Free Europe Radio Liberty Collection. Anatoly Shmylyov studied history at UCLA and UC Berkeley in May 1989, and received his PhD from the Institute of Russian History of the Russian Academy of Sciences in 1996, with a dissertation on the foreign policy of the Siberian government during the Russian Civil War. His books include Tracking a Diaspora, the Hayworth Press, 2006, The Foreign Policy of Admiral Kolchak's Government, 1918 to 1919, European University Press, in Petersburg, 2017, and his latest, In the Wake of Empire, Anti-Bolshevik Russia in International Affairs, 1917-1920, the Hoover Institution Press, 2021. Please join me in welcoming Anatoly Shmylyov. Thank you. Go.
Well, I'm glad to welcome you here today. Thank you so much, Alexander, for the introduction. I'm going to start off with telling you a little bit about Constantinople in the Russian imagination. because it was certainly the largest and most important of foreign cities in Russian political imagination, the literary imagination, for which Paris was perhaps a singularly important area. But Constantinople, or Tsargrad as it was known in previous years, the Tsar cities, was particularly important for the Russian political imagination simply because of its geographic location, as well as because of its importance as the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the empire to which Russian state considered itself the heir, beginning with Ivan III. So this city was important from the very first days of the history of Kievan Rus, when Prince Oleg attempted to take it way back in the 9th century, but failed to do so. And since then, it's been kind of a running theme through Russian history. In fact, there was the falsified or faked political testament of Peter the Great, which claimed that Russia was to attempt to take Constantinople. And of course, through the 18th and 19th century, there were several wars with the Ottoman Empire, which also, to some degrees, attempts to at least improve Russia's political situation in the Black Sea region and potentially to get access through the straits, which were controlled by Constantinople, into the Mediterranean Sea. And this was a region of particular importance in the 19th and early 20th centuries because of the role of the Navy as the major method of projecting political power of any great power abroad. So nowadays, the main attribute of great power, of course, is a nuclear arsenal. But in the 19th century, or century ago, I should say, 19th, early 20th centuries, the main attribute of a great power was its fleet. This was the primary way in which a great power was able to project its influence abroad. And it wasn't just any old naval force. In other words, it wasn't just a force that could control the shoreline and protect the ports of a country, but it was a full battle fleet, which involves ships of the line, battleships, cruisers, and of course, developing forms such as submarines and naval aviation in order to be able to combine arms in such a way that this force could be indeed used in any point on the globe. So the key to a great power status in the age of empires, and before, of course, 1917, there were many empires in the world. There was the Russian Empire, the British Empire, the German Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Japanese Empire, was control of the sea, and especially of communications and supplies. For Russia, this had always been a challenge. The vast majority of its huge shoreline was uninhabitable and ill-suited for any kind of sea travel, being locked in ice for most of the year. The Baltic, the far north around Murmansk, and the Black Sea were really the only places where you could have a fleet that would be accessible almost year-round. The far north around Murmansk, in particular, was heated up by the Gulf Stream, and so as a result, there was that ice-free port in Murmansk, but it was only developed during the First World War, essentially. So it was in little use before then, no use really before then. The Black Sea, with its most southerly position and reasonably ice-free ports, including the deep harbor of Sevastopol, was best suited for a fleet. But its entrance was blocked. The Bosphorus and Dardanelles were controlled by a hostile, or by a weak power, the Ottoman Empire. Now, Russia had long-standing interests in the Ottoman Empire, particularly in the Holy Land, but also a significant presence in Constantinople, where a Russian-owned and supported dormitory housed Orthodox pilgrims to the Holy Land. The Russian Archaeological Institute, which was established in 1888, had its headquarters, and a large embassy looked after Russian and more broadly Orthodox Christian interests within the Ottoman Empire. All this ended during the First World War, and then the Ottoman Empire went to war with the Russian Empire. And the property of the Archaeological Institute was confiscated, the embassy was shuttered, and Italy took over the defense of Russian interests within the Ottoman Empire. But after Italy entered the war, the Netherlands took over the defense of Russian interests. The war dragged on, as we know, for 4 years and ended in 1918, and it became the job of the white or anti-Bolshevik Russian government to try and reestablish the Russian presence within the Ottoman Empire. Now, this was a difficult task to accomplish because, for the same reason it was difficult to accomplish the reestablishment of the Russian presence within Germany and Austria or Hungary, simply because the Allies looked upon any sort of involvement in any of these countries formerly of the Central Powers as potential collusion between Russian monarchists and German monarchists, for example. And so it was very difficult to try to reestablish the Russian presence in these former Central Power countries, simply because the Allies looked askance at that. But it seemed that it might be a little bit simpler within the Ottoman Empire. And indeed, the Russians attempted to try and reintroduce a diplomatic presence within Constantinople pretty soon after the end of the First World War in November of 1918. Now, this was particularly important for the Russians because during the war in 1915, an agreement had been signed with the Allies that would cede Constantinople and the Straits to Russia at the end of the First World War. And this was particularly important for Russia because the Straits had been closed during the war. And that meant that Russia was cut off both from trade as well as from supplies, which made it, of course, much more difficult to conduct warfare since it was impossible to transfer supplies or to trade through the Bosphorus and Dardanelles. So this was particularly important for Russian strategic interests to be able to acquire the Straits for Russia at the end of the First World War. But of course, by that time, Russia had exited the war. The Bolsheviks took Russia out of the war. And so the Allies were in no mood to grant Russia what it had been promised during the war, simply because Russia had abandoned the Allied cause as they saw it. Now, the Whites understood that they were at a disadvantage at this point in pressing this issue, although Sergei Sazonov, the imperial foreign minister who had negotiated the cession of Constantinople, became the Russian foreign minister, or which is say the foreign minister of the White Russian government in 1918, first appointed by the southern government of General Denikin, and then later acknowledged also by Kolchak's government in Siberia. And he was present in Paris and attempted to push the Russian cause in this regard. But it was quite clear that he wouldn't be able to do it in the circumstances where there was no recognized Russian government. So it would have been difficult to claim Constantinople for the Russian government simply because it was unrecognized. But nevertheless, he still had the hope and expectation that this would be possible to accomplish. So the White Russians, in the expectation of a speedy reestablishment of a united and powerful Russian state, began to pursue an agenda that would place them in an advantageous position in the Black Sea, with the Ottoman Empire also having lost the war. This agenda included the imperative of free trade through the Straits, regardless of peace or war, as well as the closure of the Straits to any hostile naval power, more precisely to any naval power that was not bordering on the Black Sea. Now, of course, theoretically, the simplest and most direct way to accomplish this would have been to award Russia possession of Constantinople and the Straits, as the Treaty of London had stipulated during the First World War. But Allied occupation of these areas, as well as the dissolution of the Russian state into civil war with several unrecognized governments in competition with one another, made this demand futile. At a minimum, though, Russia needed to reestablish its diplomatic presence in Constantinople. So already in December of 1918, Anatoly Neratov, assistant director of the Foreign Relations Department of the government of South Russia, telegraphed the Russian ambassador at Paris, Vasily Maklakov, to begin negotiations with the French and with the British with the object of their taking over Russian interests in the formerly hostile countries of the Central Powers. In case of their agreement, the Whites could then install their own diplomatic agents in those countries to assist the Allied representatives in the work of caring for Russian interests. The first geographical centers named for this work were Constantinople and Jerusalem. In the meantime, however, the Russian ambassador at Rome, Mikhail Nikolaevich Girs, had already negotiated with the Italians to resume their patronage over Russian interests in Turkey. which had been interrupted when Italy entered the First World War on the side of the Allies in 1915. The Italians agreed to accept Boris Serafimov as Russian diplomatic advisor in the absence of a recognized Russian ambassador and a recognized Russian government. All the Russian agents abroad had only semi-official status at best. Serafimov, who before the war had held the unassuming role of third dragoman or interpreter at the Russian embassy in Constantinople, fulfilled the duties of chargé d'affaires there until October 1919, when tuberculosis caused him to retire from his post and seek treatment in Egypt. His mission was complicated by the fact that Russia had no military attachés in Turkey, so he had to not just conduct diplomatic affairs, but also was tasked with gathering military information on both the Turkish and the occupying powers for the government of South Russia. Serafimov found the state of affairs in Constantinople depressing and distressing. The French command had occupied some of the Russian diplomatic property, including the embassy, despite the protests of the Netherlands ambassador. And Serafimov had to await instructions on how to deal with the French as he hesitated to press his claims and become a thorn in the side of an ally that was supposedly coming to the aid of the whites in their civil war. After some wrangling, he was able to establish his office in the former apartment of the embassy counselor on the grounds of the embassy, though most of the property was in use by the French. His next step, after raising the Russian flag, was to call for help, as his duties were so broad and numerous that he could hardly hope to fulfill all of them himself. Complicating his already difficult position was the necessity of keeping watch over the Greeks, who had their own designs on Constantinople, as well as the Constantinople Patriarchate, or the Ecumenical Patriarchate, which had sent a legate to Paris to ask for greater Allied involvement in protecting the Greek minority in Turkey. While those actions did not directly compromise Russian interests in the region, the growth of Greek influence and the Greek hopes that Constantinople and the Straits might be ceded to Greece certainly worried the Russians. Another issue that soon began to overwhelm Serafimov was the growing stream of refugees from South Russia that by the end of 1919 and beginning of 1920 grew into a torrent. Housing, feeding, and caring for the growing number of Russians fleeing the chaos of the civil war in Russia became one of the top priorities of the Russian diplomatic representative in Constantinople. Indeed, even before the mass influx of refugees, Serafimov found his task daunting. The embassy complex had already been inundated by refugees from various nationalities. For lack of funds, they had been heating the corridors using anything that burned: furniture, staircases, and other items. Other parts of the embassy were taken over by Allied representatives. Much of Serafimov's time was spent bringing order to chaos and handling consular matters. Because he had no time for actual policy issues and informing his superiors of news in relation to Turkish and Allied policy, the government at Yekaterinodar, in the person of Anatoly Neratov, decided to send him help in the form of another junior diplomat, Georgy Kutyapov, who was appointed on April 19th, 1919, and given responsibility for strictly political affairs, particularly for informing General Denikin's government at Yekaterinodar of world events and of the policy of the Allied governments. This was an area of specific concern for the white government, as the French had just disastrously evacuated Odessa and the Crimea, and the Russians weren't sure what to expect after the failure of this phase of Allied intervention. Kutyapov was given the task of measuring the Allied temperature in occupied Constantinople, as well as in finding out what the Turks were up to and how their relationship with the Allies was developing. At first, Sazonov insisted that all Kutyapov's tasks would be adequately handled by himself and Serafimov, and he wanted to quash Kutyapov's appointment, but ultimately relented and allowed Kutyapov to assume his position alongside Serafimov, who was overburdened with all of the meticulous details that he had to deal with in Constantinople, with the refugees and with the embassy properties and other properties that the Russians were responsible for in the city and in the area. But Kutepov only spent a few weeks in Constantinople and returned to Yekaterinodar in late May 1919. It's not entirely clear why Sazonov wanted to quash his appointment. I think it partly had to do with all of Sazonov's difficulties with the governments at Omsk and Yekaterinodar, trying to kind of centralize the activities of the foreign ministry in Paris, where he was located, whereas there were a lot of reasons for having those same tasks dealt with at Yekaterinodar and Omsk, and so there are constant complications with the two governments that he had to deal with, Sazonov had to deal with. Nevertheless, Neratov continued to insist that Constantinople was such a central hub of information and political activity that he insisted that a higher level diplomat needed to be appointed. So he petitioned Foreign Minister Sazonov to appoint Prince Grigory Trubetskoy, the former ambassador to Serbia, who was then without a position in Yekaterinodar. But even that idea was not taken up. And ultimately, Serafimov became so overburdened that he became ill and began to fail at his essential duties, necessitating a replacement. Now, the figure finally appointed to replace him was a rather curious choice. It was Alexander Shcherbatskoy, who had previously been ambassador to Argentina and Brazil, and who had simply abandoned his post in 1918 and left for Europe. Shcherbatskoy ultimately was forgiven and appointed to Constantinople in October 1919 after Serafimov retired. And he was finally able to raise the Russian flag over the embassy complex only in November of 1919, when the staff of the Allied command in Constantinople evacuated the quarters that they had previously occupied and released them finally to Shcherbatskoy. Shcherbatskoy ultimately was cashiered by General Vrangin when he took command of Russian forces in the Crimea following Denikin's resignation, and Neratov himself was appointed the Russian representative in Constantinople, ultimately in April of 1920. Now, at the very heart of the Russian presence in Constantinople, the embassy complex, which was partially returned to the White Russians for their use by the Allies, soon became the center of a massive scandal, which was the assassination of the former chief of staff of the armed forces of South Russia, General Denikin's right-hand man, General Ivan Romanovsky. So on April 2nd, 1920, General Denikin resigned his command with the White Army in South Russia in favor of General Peter Vrangel, was then living in exile in Constantinople. So Vrangel had previously resigned his command as a result of intrigues and differences of opinion with General Denikin, and he had been living with his family in Constantinople since February of 1920. Already at that time, he described both the city's dazzling beauty as well as the pitiful condition of the Russian refugees who were present there, some of them who were given refuge in the embassy itself, others lived outside at various properties. And Vrangel was summoned back to take Denikin's place on April 4th, 1920. So Denikin, together with his chief of staff, General Romanovsky, left for Constantinople. The day following their arrival, April 5th, while Denikin was meeting in one of the embassy quarters with the Russian military attaché, General Agapeyev, someone broke into the room where General Romanovsky was sitting awaiting him and assassinated Romanovsky. It was a huge scandal. It's not entirely clear the circumstances of what took place, but it seems like this was kind of an attempt to punish General Romanovsky, who was considered to be behind the failure of Denikin's attempt to take Moscow late in 1919. In other words, the advance on Moscow, which failed and which caused a reversal for the White Army, which ultimately led to further disasters and the evacuation of Novorossiysk, with the army leaving for the Crimea, was blamed in large measure, not even so much on General Denikin as on his chief of staff, General Romanovsky, and that turned out to be the reason for his assassination in Constantinople. Now, there was fear for the life of Denikin as well, and that's why the very next day he left for England and remained, of course, the rest of his life abroad. Numerous as the refugees of 1919 and early 1920 in Constantinople were, their numbers increased dramatically after the evacuation of General Vrangel's army, together with civilians, from the Crimea in November of 1920. Altogether, some 150,000 refugees arrived in Constantinople at that time, and though many military men were soon assigned to special camps in various places in Turkey, more or less accessible from Constantinople, A large number of refugees, mostly civilians, remained in Constantinople with no further place to go. The situation for Russians after the war in Constantinople was particularly disheartening. The huge dormitory property that had previously housed pilgrims had been closed by the Turks when war was declared, and thereafter was rented by an entrepreneur who obtained a 10-year lease from the Brotherhood of the Constantinople Monastery on Mount Athos, which owned the property. The entrepreneur then rented out various rooms and areas, going so far as to open nightclubs and pubs on the property, and until finally the Brotherhood took him to court and forced him to shut down the dens of iniquity. But the Russians still saw no benefit from the property, as the lease retained its validity, and the only improvement was in the nature of the businesses established there. Housing had to be sought elsewhere. Part of the embassy was converted to a hospital to help the ill and wounded. At first, the French, who had recognized General Wrangel's government, took on the burden of aid to the Russian refugees. But their munificence was short-lived. They soon informed the Russians that they would cease aid on January 1st, 1921. However, the humanitarian catastrophe was so great that Wrangel was able to apply pressure that made the French relent and continue aid on a lesser level for several months longer. But this aid was not benevolent. It came at the price of the ships that the Russians had arrived on, which were sold for further use as scrap metal. Aside from France, much aid had been received by Russian refugees from the American Red Cross, which was in turn the recipient of full support by Admiral Mark Bristol, the commander of U.S. naval forces in Turkish waters and High Commissioner to Turkey, and his wife, Helen Beverly. Both of them appealed to the headquarters of the American Red Cross to expand its aid more than was originally expected, an act for which the Russians were very grateful, eulogizing Bristol after his death in 1939. They remembered him to the end of his days. On the part of the American Red Cross, its head of operations for assisting the Russian refugees in Constantinople, Anna V. Mitchell, was also committed to the cause, and long after the American Red Cross ceased its operations in this regard, she headed the American Committee for Russian Refugees in Constantinople. By early 1921, the Russian community in and around the city was amorphic, shifting, but nevertheless static enough to support the appearance of publishing and cultural activities at some level. Perhaps not the level of Paris, Berlin, Prague, or Belgrade at the time, but nevertheless of enough strength that it deserves notice. Though official and semi-official bulletins of various organizations, such as the Russian Press Bureau or the Russian Boy Scouts, appeared as early as 1919, followed by attempts to issue newspapers. Some were abortive, such as Вечерняя Slovo in 1919, and others were more successful, such as Вечерняя Pressa, which began in 1920 and existed all the way through 1925. Literary and cultural periodicals came later. One of the first to appear was a literary almanac, Наши дни, which was carried over from Sevastopol, where it was first published by Victor Seversky. Despite the catastrophic financial position of the refugees, Наши дни had quite a dignified appearance, with color illustrations and print and no small attention to design. The periodical came out in Russian and in French, although it's difficult to say what the French angle was. It could have been French, possibly financial support for the periodical's publication, and potentially using it as a propaganda outlet. Two other literary and cultural periodicals appeared even earlier. Жизнь и искусство ceased after its first issue, published on the 6th of February 1921, but Zernice, which had also begun publication in February of 1921, continued till at least November of that year. Curiously, the issues until the beginning of July were marked ineligible for sale in Constantinople, which was presumably due to Allied censorship. But nevertheless, the appearance of these titles, in addition to newspapers, gave some indication of the level of social, literary, and cultural activity at that time. The authors of Zernice included well-known and established literary names, such as the satirist Arkady Averchenko, writers Nikolai Chebyshev, Yevgeny Chirikov, and Ilya Surguchov, as well as poet Maximilian Voloshin, who contributed to the journal despite remaining behind in the Crimea. Their picture of Russians remaining in and around Constantinople at that time was bleak. They were living in shanties on edges of the city, worse than anywhere else. They stooped low for a piece of bread, and yet the youth yearned to move forward and get an education and not lose their humanity. So they established educational institutions such as a faculty of law and commercial courses, and hoping to establish ultimately a commercial institute or business school in the area. The American Red Cross and YMCA helped a great deal with this. They were active in bringing in Russian textbooks on technical subjects and language learning guides. And other bibliophiles and specialists have identified a large number of publications that came out in this period, but not all have survived to the present day. So they're very difficult to find nowadays in libraries. The advertising sections of Наши дни and Zarnitsi give some picture of the Russian community in Constantinople. There were publishing houses such as Ruskaya Мысль with a reading library and bookstore, and El Babak and Sons, a banking and investment house, a fortune teller, pharmacies, doctors of various specialties. Plenty of learned academics and political activists gave lectures, while singers, actors, and dancers gave concerts and staged plays and ballets. Medved, or the Bear, was the name of one of the first Russian restaurants, followed by America. But Russian cabarets, musicians, and dancers were in strong demand in other establishments as well, helped by Turks, Greeks, and other foreigners. Pyotr Smirnov established his trading house where he sold his branded vodka, among other things. Pawn shops and commission boutiques flourished. A Russian court adjudicated disputes and even crimes committed by Russian nationals, including at least one murder. The existence of an extraterritorial court had been granted by the Ottoman government in the 18th century as a result of military defeat, but by 1921 it was an anachronism, and the Turks began to apply pressure to cease the consular court's powers. The youth had schools and a scouting organization. As of March 31, 1921, the League of Nations estimated that some 62,000 Russian men were settled in Constantinople and its environs. Many were forced to seek work outside the city, where conditions were worse, and the lack of any social life and community support made psychological adjustment much more difficult. As one traveler noted, over the entire route from Constantinople to the Greek border, one sees cheap Russian labor. On every station, the coal is unloaded and firewood is loaded by Russians. They put up the telegraph lines, they fix the roads, they guard warehouses on some stations, and they herd flocks of sheep. Life was definitely easier in Constantinople, where cultural and social activities, including sport and gaming, provided both relief from tedium and poverty, as well as social glue for the community. The Rostov Riding Club had managed to evacuate its thoroughbreds to Constantinople, where it attempted to draw crowds to horse races, with wagering expected to provide significant income. But the cost of feed proved prohibitive, and the attempt failed, so the horses were sold off. More enterprising souls then came up with the idea of cockroach races, where feed was not a problem, and the novelty brought in extraordinary income from bookmaking. Collected from local bathhouses, the enormous insects, with nicknames such as Dream, Lemnos, Love Me, and Trotsky, were hitched to wire carts and released in a bounded racecourse set up on an enormous tabletop. Literature lovers will immediately note that this is one of the scenes in Mikhail Bulgakov's Bek, as well as a basis for several tales by Arkady Virchin. Bulgakov, though he served with the Whites during the Russian Civil War, never left Russia. So he must have learned of these games through either the press or stories by repatriates. Politically, the Russians were more or less united around the Russian Council, or Ruski Soviet, set up by General Vrangin on April 5th, 1921. With Vrangel at its head, the surgeon and professor Ivan Alexinsky was his first deputy, and Zemstvo activist and politician Vladimir Musin Pushkin was his second deputy. The goal of the Russian Council was to assist the Russian refugees and Russian army in every way possible, particularly feeding, housing, and employment, to prevent the dispersion of the émigrés to the ends of the earth, especially to Brazil or to French colonies as members of the French Foreign Legion, and also to prevent their repatriation to Soviet Russia, and to ensure their resettlement to nearby lands in an organized fashion, so that they could easily be called to arms again when the occasion arose, and it was always when, not if. Another goal was to promote Vrangelianist policies, which were often attacked both on personal and ideological grounds by left-leaning émigré circles in Paris, Prague, and Berlin. The Russian Council activated and organized Russian life in Constantinople, particularly political life, but also social, charitable, and economic activity, insofar as it became more directed and concrete. including aid to refugees, resettlement, and all manner of émigré activities, which took on greater efficiency and spread abroad as the Russian Council's authority increased to the émigré communities forming in Bulgaria and Yugoslavia. The Council's activities were particularly important during a period when Wrangel himself was isolated from his men by the French and largely confined to his yacht Lupul, which was ultimately rammed and sunk by an Italian ship in a mysterious accident in quotes, in October 1921. Very often this has been portrayed as a navigational error, but in reality, it was most likely an assassination attempt driven by the Soviet government. Wrangel himself managed to escape the disaster. He simply was not on board at that time. So Wrangel and the Russian Council made every effort to keep the army together as a fighting unit and to care for the needs of the civilian refugees. But this became increasingly difficult with every passing week. By March 1921, the French, who had previously recognized Wrangel's government and were chiefly responsible, therefore, for victualling the Russians and expressing some level of care for them, were ready to abandon these responsibilities and began to press for various solutions to the refugee problem, either return to Soviet Russia or emigration to Brazil or finding work in the local area. All three possibilities found adherence among the mass of Russians whose position was often felt to be hopeless. Some 4,000 left for Brazil, an undetermined number, primarily Cossacks, reaching over 10,000 in total, returned to Soviet Russia. Others were able to find local employment or emigrate further abroad or scrape by on humanitarian aid, begging, and peace work. Some 3,000 were enrolled in the French Foreign Legion. The relations with the French improved a bit in April with the appointment of a new local French commander. The real breakthrough came in the form of successful negotiations on the resettlement of the bulk of the Russians, mainly army veterans, in the Balkans in the spring of 1921. Indeed, by mid-1921, the city was beginning to empty as increasing numbers of refugees began to resettle, primarily in Yugoslavia and Bulgaria, but sometimes also in other countries as far away as Brazil, which was actively recruiting new settlers. Large numbers, particularly Cossacks from the camps on Lemnos and other localities, also voluntarily returned to Soviet Russia, unable to bear the privations of refugee life and yearning for their families, friends, fellow villagers, and return to their traditional way of life. The repatriation movement was driven by overt and covert Soviet attempts to play on émigré nostalgia. One of the newspapers published in Constantinople beginning in February 1921, called Konstantinopolskie Izvestia, was funded by the Cheka, the Soviet secret police, and published by a local communist cell. Much was made of the return of General Slashchov to Soviet Russia, followed by a small number of other senior and junior military commanders. Despite this growing wave of movement out of Constantinople, the city retained its significance as a center for Russian life for some time. On June 22nd, 1921, a Russian Orthodox Church Council was convened in Constantinople under the chairmanship of Bishop Veniamin Pechenkov of Sevastopol, with Wrangel issuing a welcoming address to the delegates. Theaters continued to feature Russian opera stars and choruses, and social and cultural life continued unabated and may have done so for some time, except that real life intervened. In September of 1921, the American Red Cross began shutting down its operations to assist Russian refugees in Constantinople and surrounding areas. Concretely, this meant the loss of some 17,000 daily rations and the $8,000 a day that the American Red Cross was spending on the Russians in the area. Resettlement became even more imperative under these circumstances, and the Russian Council, along with the Central United Committee of Russian Charitable Organizations, appealed far and wide for further assistance. Many Russians were still sleeping under open skies, and it was difficult to pry army tents out of the Allies to provide some cover from the elements in the face of the oncoming winter. Despite the fact that Wrangel's army was largely resettled in the course of 1921, and many other refugees ultimately found their way to the Balkans, Brazil, and other European countries, or returned to Soviet Russia, by 1923, several thousand Russians still remained in and around Constantinople, with no legal protection, as the Russian embassy had been closed, and the Soviet government bore no responsibility for them, nor did the refugees seek to ask it for any help. Their position in Constantinople and its environs was very precarious, both politically and financially. However, through the efforts of Admiral Bristol, Anson Phelps Stokes, who was the canon of Washington Cathedral, and a philanthropist, Red Cross worker Anna V. Mitchell, and other lobbyists in Washington, D.C., the United States of America allowed the entry of some 2,200 Russian refugees from Constantinople in 1923. Admiral Bristol remained committed to helping the remaining approximately 2,000 refugees in Constantinople long after he returned to the U.S. In 1935, he appealed to the public for assistance in a letter to the Washington Post. For this reason, the Russian refugees in Constantinople, both those who came to the U.S. in 1923, as well as those who remained in Constantinople, were always grateful to Bristol, Mitchell, and the other Americans who took their sufferings to heart and attempted to help as much as they could. The Russian presence, of course, in Constantinople continued for many decades afterwards. There is a wonderful book by Jacques Villon, I don't know if you can see it here, called The White Russians in Istanbul, came out in 1995. And he covers a lot of their activity, including the musicians, the painters, the general cultural life, the Russian restaurants, and so on and so forth, cabarets, nightclubs that were founded here and that still continue to exist into the 1930s, 40s, and so on. So with that, I'll end my presentation and turn it over.
Stay in the camera. Thank you, Anatol, for this presentation that will bear many different views to understand what happened. I lost power here. I wanted to show Anatol's book, which recently came out, and okay, sorry, a little technical problem here. Wanted to show Anatol's book In the Wake of Empire, that this is, partly based on, but thank you, Anatol. Yes. Very few physical traces remain from the 3 years of the Russian moment in Istanbul. Of the 3 or 4 penthouse chapels themselves adopted as Anatol was talked about, by emigres from earlier pilgrimage churches, pilgrimage hotels. They were all located in close proximity to each other and the port. 2 of them survive as active churches to the small remaining community, at least a small community that was here before 2022. And so these are some of the images shot inside the 2 chapels, which I'll just let this scroll through. They're not often all open, and they're very, very small. The Para Hotel is the next image. So the Para Hotel, which you'll see shortly, was one of the social hubs, restaurants and nightclubs that were frequented by, or worked in, were established by the new arrivals. And it's one of the few places that remains basically as it appeared 100 years ago. But the farewell almanac, a thick multi-page thank you note from the departing Russian community, published at the end of 1923, listed dozens of new social institutions, schools, nurseries, orphanages, soup kitchens, social assistance sites, hostels set up by the émigrés, often with Allied assistance, who then proceeded to create artist clubs, restaurants, commercial ventures, publications that created an entire independent Russian social infrastructure. And I would like to now introduce Timur Saitov, our next lecturer. He's a PhD candidate at the History Department of Binghamton University, the State University of New York. He's one of the few scholars focused on the subject, the exact subject that brought us here today. His dissertation title is the modern refugees, is Russian exiles in post-World War I Istanbul, modern refugees, and the transition from Ottoman imperial to Turkish Republican rule. He has an MA in Middle Eastern and Ottoman history from Binghamton University, and a BA in modern Middle Eastern history and political sciences from Tel Aviv University. Please join me in welcoming Timur Saitov.
Thank you, Alexander, for this introduction, and thank you for inviting me for this fascinating event. I will share my screen with you in a moment. Okay. In my research, I focus less on diplomatic aspect of Russian immigrant stay in Constantinople, Istanbul, and more on the circumstances and position from on the ground in which the refugees tried to survive, basically, in the city. One of the aspects of my research is the dichotomy between the voices of refugees, the agency of the refugees on the one hand, and the perception of refugees by the allies, by the responsibility administrations of the occupied city, perceptions of these refugees as a mass of individual refugees. That's a situation that probably created a basis for a new concept of refugees, a modern concept of refugees that exists today, and on which all the refugee regime is based. And I argue, one of my arguments is that this modern understanding of refugees was based on this case of Russian refugees in Istanbul. The emergent civil society in the late Russian Empire was among the primary reasons for the push for the reforms in Russia. First, it opposed the absolute monarchy, and later the dictatorial Bolshevik rule, in a way a civil society would oppose any autocratic government. As was the case in Russia, in exile too, the All-Russian Union of Zemstvos and the Union of Russian Towns played the role of viable alternative to the central government. Leaving aside political concerns of the Russian consul in Istanbul, these two organizations, under the supervision of the revived abroad unifying Zemgor organization, focused on providing necessary help to Russian refugees. This self-governing body focused on raising funds for Russians from Russian and international sources in order to create a network of employment, housing, health, education, and leisure. The organization established around a dozen of workshops where the refugees worked and received their subsistence. Dormitories, orphanages, hospitals, and dining rooms were distributed throughout the city, including in the European neighborhoods of Harbiye, Shishli, Taksim, Kumbaraji, and Buyukdere, as well as Kadıköy on the Asian side, and on the island of Prinkipo, Büyükada, among others. Russian Postal Service was organized by Zemgor by support communication between many refugee camps scattered throughout the Mediterranean region and to preserve a sense of unity in the Russian community. Caring about leisure time, Zemgor also established barbershops, orchestras, and theaters. The administration's main concern was to prevent evacuees from Russia from being dependent on charity and, quote, falling into a state of refugeedom, end quote. However, the Russian elites found themselves in a constant struggle with the Allied representatives in the city for the status and fate of the Russian community in Istanbul, while trying to preserve the community's Russian national identity and to provide its viability, prove its viability. The occupational forces, the Allied occupational administration, were reluctant to perceive the community of refugees from Russia as independent and autonomous, as it went against their interest and geopolitical circumstances. Beginning with individual immigration in 1918, and later supplemented by the quote-unquote waves of organized evacuations, by the end of 1920, a large number of refugees from former Russian Empire gathered in Istanbul and its vicinity. The refugees continued to arrive in small batches as the terror and famine developed in Soviet Russia up until the end of 1921. The question of what to do with and how to accommodate these masses of people were very acute for the administrations in the city. Helping Russian refugees, however, was not the first concern of the not the first concern for the exhausted by war and politically motivated allies in the recently occupied city in Istanbul. This task became especially burdensome when 150,000 refugees from Crimea arrived at once in November 1920, in a city already full of Armenian, Greek, and Turkish refugees fleeing from the countryside. Besides practical difficulties in housing and feeding Russian refugees, taking responsibility for them would compromise the uneasy political relationships of the allies with the Bolshevik government and endanger delicate trading ties with them that the allies managed to create in pursuing their economic interests. Thus, while taking control of the city, the allies were not happy with the aspect of responsibility for their Russian allies that came with this control. Acting as a refugee hosting territory, refugee hosting government, the Allied governors imagined Russian refugees as others, with all their associated problems. Additionally, regardless of who would be considered an official host of the Russian refugees, either Ottoman government or the Allies, none of the sides had clearly prescribed guidelines for the treatment of refugees. 100 years ago, no normative system existed in relation to refugees, and there was no understanding of what to do with refugees who did not have any protection from any state. No refugee convention outlining rights and ways of protection for refugees existed. There were no human rights principles that would set the standard for living conditions in refugee camps. No concept of the first country of asylum granting a minimum of protection, no refoulement principle saving people from being sent back to the chaos they just escaped. Just vague concepts of humanity and honor to guide the assistance and a national reputation to save. This situation left room for arbitrary decisions and steps in regard to the refugees. The Allied administration in the city declared refugees from Russia guests. Having lost their subjecthood and without any other certain status, the refugees remained with only this vague status. A refugee, Igor Vsevolodovich Simonovich, challenges even this status, saying in his diary that, quote, although we are considered guests here, we were and are treated totally not as such. And they already almost openly pronounce that we cannot feed you anymore. Get out of here. It is time to go home. But where will we go when we do not have home? It is time finally to put an end to this unnatural situation and either shoot us down as harmful cast of element or start considering us people, end quote. His personal sufferings and the conditions of misery make him indiscriminately blame both the Allies and the Turks, although he mentions that some Turks pity the refugees. The repatriation solution was a preferable way to resolve the quote-unquote Russian refugee question. Initially, though, after the evacuation of Odessa in April 1919, the Allies were willing to help these refugees. The general discussion that Britain must save Russian aristocrats and the quote-unquote better class people was evident in the early stages of the evacuation from different evacuations from South Russia. Special requests were made on behalf of the aristocrats and quote-unquote personal friends of the empress to evacuate them from Russia, and even, despite the prohibition, to allow them to enter Britain. The Allies settled the evacuated refugees in the Prince Islands, 7,000 to 8,000 people under the French responsibility, and in the British military base in Malta, approximately 2,000 people. However, from now on, one of the main British concerns regarding refugees from Russia will be how much and who will repay for the refugees. Since many of these refugees had influential patrons in European capitals, it was thought that all the expenses for the refugees will be redirected to a variety of Russian funds organized by the Russian aristocracy in Europe. Russian imperial assets deposited in Europe provided a basis for the bills later submitted to imperial governmental bodies in exile. British and French aid to the refugees was thought of as short-term assistance. It was just a courtesy and absolutely not full-scale assistance to all refugees from Russia. Thus, starting from January 1919, in Istanbul existed an inter-allied passport bureau, one of the goals of which was preventing quote-unquote undesirable passage from Russia. On November 13th, 1920, the day of the largest evacuation from Crimea, the British government sent a telegram stating, quote, His Majesty's government have definitely decided that in no circumstances will they afford any assistance to enable Russians to escape from Crimea. It is evidently impossible for refugees to be allowed to land at Constantinople. And if refugees arrive there, they must be sent on at once, end quote. If Russian refugees eventually managed to land in the Istanbul area, it was only because of the pressure of the humanity and national reputation concerns, and because of the advocacy of powerful individuals on the ground, such as Admiral de Robek, General Milne, and General Harrington. So generally, there was no any neutral zone signified designed for Russian refugees to come and feel comfortable while resolving different legal issues. It was just matter of fact that these people were suspended in Constantinople indefinitely with very vague status. So it was just a technical thing that Allies couldn't just throw them out, and that's why they kept them in the city for a while. With more refugees arriving and with the decision of all European countries to close their borders to the refugees, the Allied representatives in Istanbul started looking for ways to quote-unquote dispose refugees from Russia that happened to be under the Allies' responsibility to different locations and obviously outside of their home country's territory. Boris Serafimov, who was for a certain period Russian chargé d'affaires in Istanbul, and whom Anatol mentioned in his presentation, willingly or not facilitated the Allies' idea to distribute Russian refugees from Istanbul elsewhere. Russian Relief Committee organized by Serafimov in Istanbul suggested to the Allies, first, evacuating civilian refugees from the war zones in South Russia to Istanbul, and then repatriating them back to other South Russian territories under the control of the white government, not affected by the hostilities. While the Allies did repatriate certain undesirable, quote unquote, undesirable people back to Russia beforehand, the suggestion of Serafimov was a suggestion of Serafimov as an official representative of the Kolchak-Denikin governments in Istanbul opened for them an opportunity for consensual mass repatriation. It is not clear whether the decision about repatriation was properly authorized or even sincere on the part of Serafimov, or it was just a tactical way to convince the Allies to assist in the evacuation of refugees from South Russia. Similarly, it is hard to say whether the Allies sincerely believed that the refugees will be safe when repatriated back to Russia, or it was just a convenient way for them to get rid of the masses of refugees. Either way, the repatriation of refugees will be a permanent theme in the correspondence of the Allies, even after Bolsheviks conquered entire South Russia, except the Crimean Peninsula, even after Crimea was captured as well, and despite the protests against repatriation from the refugees themselves. Throughout this period, there were several attempts to create an international organization under the leadership of Russian representatives that would be able to adequately defend the interests of all refugees from Russia abroad. For example, there were attempts to make Russian Red Cross such an international organization that would embrace all other charitable, humanitarian, philanthropic organizations under their roof. There were also attempts to make Zemgor also tried to become such an international organization with collaboration with the Council of Ambassadors in Paris. French also suggested, the French government also suggested, and forgive me my pronunciation, Association Générale de Secours, an organization that would be led by the Russian representatives and would resolve all the problems that refugees faced then. An interesting example was where when Andrei Mandelstam, a Russian diplomat and lawyer that was focused on questions of human rights and international status, he also suggested a kind of a patronage status for Russian refugees under the protection of France, regardless of where these refugees would be scattered throughout the world. They would have the protection of France, extraterritorial protections of France. However, the conflicting interests of many states in the period after World War I effectively shut these attempts down. The refugees ended up becoming a category of modern refugees dependent on the bureaucracy of international institutions and were settled in a variety of places in the world. Nevertheless, many refugees did gather in European capitals, including Paris, Berlin, and New York, some immigrating directly from Russia, others using their social capital to leave behind the hardships of Istanbul, and many continuing their wanderings from the places where they initially distributed to, primarily from Serbia and other Balkan countries. Despite the absence of proper statistics, we know, though, that many refugees that arrived in Istanbul 100 years ago, against all odds, managed to stay here, leaving many traces of their presence here in the social fabric of the city, as Anatol already also presented this. I would end my part here, and if any questions would arise, I would be happy to answer.
Thank you, Timur. Fascinating presentation. Again, so much material that we'll have to view this again to get the full understanding. So thank you very much. So we're broadcasting today from the 100-year-old Russian Café Rejans that has been frequented by some of our ancestors and probably worked in by some other ones. This is the only remaining completely preserved and lovingly restored actually Russian social space that, in addition, still serves a largely authentic and superbly executed selection of Russian food and drinks. It's a delicious time capsule of that intense formative period, perhaps illustrating more than anything the absence of those who reinvented themselves and left to live in the rest of the free world, taking with them their new social infrastructure Constantinople allowed them to create, while transforming itself as well into modern Istanbul, with just a little imprint on its social and cultural patterns left by its former Russian visitors. So let's just let the camera roam over the walls of Café Rejans as we transition to Grigory Galitsyn, who talked to us about the Russian Nobility Association's programs and social agenda.
Thank you, Sasha. A big thank you to our presenters today. What an interesting subject, made that much more enticing by virtue of the origination location, the Café Rejans in Istanbul, Turkey. And of course, thank you to all of you for spending some time with us this afternoon. If anyone else in the audience has questions, you may direct them to the speakers and the panelists using the Q&A feature of Zoom. And also, if you're interested in donating, you can visit the Russian Nobility Association online at russiannobility.org. And your generous donations allow us to continue our charitable work, as well as bringing you fascinating lecture content like what we were listening to today. As many of you are no doubt aware, the Russian Nobility Association in America is a charitable organization that embraces philanthropic and genealogical aims. The association also directs donations to organizations which provide shelter, food, and medical treatment for disadvantaged persons around the world. At present, the association is supporting refugees displaced by the situation that continues to unfold in Ukraine through the International Orthodox Christian Charities, which is doing incredible work in assisting these people. Among our other programs, our lecture series supports the Prince Alexis Shcherbatov Scholarship Fund, as well as numerous individuals, camps, and other projects here in the United States and abroad. So any amount is welcome, whether it's $20, $50, or whatever amount you can spare. Rest assured your donation will be put to good use. So at this point, I will turn it back over to our moderator in Istanbul, who will begin the Q&A portion of today's lecture. Sasha, back to you.
Thank you, Grisha. So my first question is directed vaguely to Anatol. It's coming from someone who grew up 50 years after the Russian Revolution in a Russian community where I could speak Russian, go to Russian Sunday school, have Russian friends. Some of my generation in New York City could attend regular Russian school on a daily basis, besides going to church, to social events, allowing them to meet and create families, to write, publish, and read Russian books and periodicals, and so on. When dissident authors after World War II sent works out to the West, and eventually were themselves sent into exile, both their works and they landed on fertile Russian intellectual property and community. So, in the context of what can be looked at as a diplomatic and military objective failure of the émigrés as they were focused on Constantinople, it seems that at least one agenda of the Russian community was a success.
Well, absolutely. I think we talk about success in multiple ways. One of them was to show that pre-revolutionary Russian civil society was active and engaged. I mean, it's very often Russian society before the revolution is looked at as some sort of cardboard two-dimensional image of being an authoritarian monarchy with virtually no civil society, but obviously it wasn't. And the emigration shows that in particular because organizations were formed and founded right away. They became effective immediately. And they were led by people from various social strata with various goals and activities in mind. And so this is one of the aspects in which Russian immigration sort of justified the society that it originated from within the Russian Empire as a method of showing their possibilities of activity, even in the absence of any kind of state support or support from any foreign government. So this social activities is important to note of the Russian emigres. It came out of their lives in pre-revolutionary Russia, and it continued even in the desperate circumstances that they found themselves in as refugees, especially in the first years when the circumstances were particularly desperate. It also is, it's a story of resilience, and that's also an important subject to talk about because despite the defeat and despair of emigration, many remained active and optimistic. They formed organizations right away. They helped their fellow children and other members of the community, the ill, the wounded, and so on and so forth, to try and survive in this atmosphere. So this resilience is also another aspect of the success of the Russian emigration. They certainly didn't give in to depression as they easily could have. Then it's also important to point out that these centers of activity survived for a very, very long time. If you take a look at the Russian Scouting Organization, founded in 1909, it still exists abroad. It still exists. It exists over 114 years or so after it was founded. The Soviet Union, with all of its resources, with all of its oil, gas, gold, precious metals, and all of its other resources, only lasted 75 years. Russian immigrant organizations have outlasted them. What does that tell you about the strength of the Russian spirit? I think it tells you more than anything that the Soviet Union could accomplish. And finally, the preservation of Russian culture, tradition, and history in opposition to what the Soviet Union was portraying as the Russian past and its history and its culture. So this is another important aspect to note of the Russian immigration, that the accent was a bit different. It was different how the emigres looked at their own history than from the Soviet official standpoint. And I think that that aspect of Russian immigration still needs to be examined more thoroughly in order to really identify those aspects of the Russian heritage and tradition, which are particularly important, because unfortunately, even to this day, we're very much sort of under the shadow of Soviet interpretations. So perhaps that could be the answer to your question. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Anatol. Just a short question to Timur. Anatoly Neratov, the chief of mission, my great uncle, writes in the Almanac about the initial task of feeding, housing, and clothing the hundreds of thousands of destitute arrivals, and then refers to the onerous task of legalizing them. It appears that the refugees do not need, you can't move. I seem to have lost something. I think we skipped that question because we just lost it.
I think I understand what you mean by this. So legal status was very vague for the Russian refugees, and initially they were considered Russian subjects until the December of 1921, when the Soviet Russia denationalized this all the Russian subjects who existed abroad at that by this particular moment, and this Russian subjecthood was not certain, because the Russianness was perceived very suspiciously by many governments at that period. They feared of Bolsheviks, of course, and the general status of of Russians in any country was very vague, and there was a discussion in the British government how to consider Russians as allies or neutral citizens or even enemy citizens, because of the official status of Russia was not concrete and sure. And after the December 21, the Russians didn't have anything, like just any status. And when you mentioned the legalizing status of Russian refugees in Istanbul, I believe the main focus was how to legally transfer Russians from Istanbul to other places. Because to cross borders, you have to have certain documents, passports or visas or something, and you cannot issue a visa to a person who doesn't have any passport. So that was one of the main legal concerns: what to do with legally with this movements through through borders. And as it's known, they came with the solution inventing the so-called nonsense passports. The kind of agreement that different countries in the world would accept this certificate issued by the League of Nations and by the Commission headed by Fridtjof Nansen. Not all of the countries accepted this, but this passport, Nansen passport, did facilitate movement of masses of Russian refugees from country to other country. There were one trick though. Using this certificate meant that you can leave Istanbul, but this certificate never allowed these people come back. It's not a substitute for a passport. It was a way how these Russian people could go to other place and they would stay there permanently, regardless of their rights, regardless of the employment, regardless of anything. It was just a way how to allow the transition of these people from Constantinople to any other place.
Timur, a short other question. Did you, in looking at sort of the legalization status of Russians, did you detect any sort of qualitative differentiation about who went to which country? Like, for instance, we know that the royal families were whisked off to England almost immediately. I'm gathering that there was a selective process by which some Russians of the the so-called better families or intellectuals ended up going to Paris, and then others ended up going to the coal mine somewhere. Was there such a process, or is this just my imagination?
No, there was such a process, a categorization of Russian refugees, and it's one of the aspects that I study in my research, how this process happened, because generally refugees it's not just elites, it's not just aristocrats, it's a huge body of strata of different people, and as a rule, these elites, the Allied elites, didn't want these people to come to Western Europe. The exceptions that they did were for a very select number of people, as you mentioned, the royal family went primarily to England, and aristocrats were allowed. They were more lenient toward elites of Russian migrants to give them visas, and especially if they had some friends, protections in these countries. But the masses of refugees, for them, the territory of Western Europe was practically closed. And the Allies decided, very much pushed the Balkan countries to receive masses of refugees. The considerations were like, okay, Russian people speak Russian, and it's very similar to languages of the Balkan countries, and they're also ethnically similar, so they kind of brothers. And they literally pushed politically governments of Serbia specifically and other countries to receive masses of refugees. And there was some financial agreements between these countries, so they were paid for these refugees. And categorization happened also on the professional level. Serbia and Bulgaria and other countries were particularly interested in they called them agriculturalists, people who could go and work on the field. And that was one of the best priorities for Russians to have. If you're not physically strong, if you have some disabilities, aged people, they literally had almost zero chances to be picked up by the countries. So there was some selections and there was some categorization of people. Czech government prioritized educated persons, like professors, students. So there were different dynamics and different directions of flow of refugees. And there were lists of professions that this country required. And people in Istanbul started to organize themselves accordingly for professional units, farmers, craftsmen, and different professions, educated people, etc. So there was a process that Russian sources would call denationalization. While being a community, Russian community in Istanbul, many there was a dynamic that fragmented this community. One of the aspects was unions by profession, unions by ethnicity, unions by cultural background, etc.
Timur, thank you. So now we're ready for the next phase of this session. And I'd like to introduce, and I'll try to turn the camera towards two recent arrivals to Istanbul, Katya and Konstantin Boatovsky. And I've been hearing recently from recent arrivals here and everywhere that they have not only left Russia, but they've actually been fleeing Russianness. Perhaps it was easier for the first wave to maintain being Russian when the country they left was called by another name. Although I had to answer during my entire childhood the question, are you a communist? But how do you now define who you are? Do you see any role for yourselves as counteracting the Russian invasion of Ukraine? Do you think you'll ever go back to a different Russia? How do you see your futures? I'm turning it over to Konstantin and
First of all, I'm not sure about my English.
It's perfect.
At least in comparison with previous speakers. Поэтому я бы предпочел говорить по-русски.
I think most of our listeners are English speakers, so maybe we can try both languages.
Okay, I'll try.
I think your English is fine.
Okay, I will try to. First of all, we are, as I understand our wave of immigration, we all are not feeling ourselves completely out of Russia because of modern technologies of work. Biggest part of us are still working for Russia. We have
For Russia, I mean for Russian
for
entities,
Russian companies,
instead of
for Russian
museums, whatever.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. We have mighty financial, informational, and other connections with Russia still. We are feeling ourselves relocants more than immigrants. If we doesn't going to return to Russia in closest future, we still having very strong connections with Russia yet. And it's our it's same time our преимущество, advantage and disadvantage, because if this connection will be broken, we will fail in very difficult situation.
It's a, I've encountered both opinions. I've encountered people in New York, for instance, that have left and are saying, I'll never go back to Russia. I just don't want anything to do with the country, because they were able to land on their feet and function outside of Russia without a connection with it. But so there's always this economic argument of still working with. But Kasia, you
I think it's
jump in?
practically the same. Sorry for my English. For me, it's too hard to talk about it because I couldn't find a place for me here yet. I hope I do it. Maybe it's Istanbul, maybe in some other country and city. But now we have very strong connection with our neighbor. And
But you don't see yourself going back. We spoke earlier. And there is yes a connection which is technologically
We are not going
allowed, but going back is not an option.
it's not a way for us.
Yeah.
But now, Kostya, I think, found something for him. He found his way. I'm not yet. Because that's why it's difficult for me to be calm.
Oh, yeah.
Well, it's very hard way for me, but I know that it's right way. And it seems to me like more difficult part of our relocation, immigration, whatever, is прощание с прошлым.
It's the farewell to your past, farewell to your past. Yeah, I was going to actually mention that the word that fleeing Russianness is in some ways fleeing your own self. You have to go through a transformation process, which is why this comparison with the first wave is apt, because the first wave didn't have to battle their own nature, because they had the perhaps privilege of fighting a civil war with an enemy that staked out a political position which was radically different than the position of the first wave. So as clear, or there was a clear demarcation, redefinition that has to happen now. But yet many encounters that I had in New York with recent arrivals, those people have left Russia completely. And the question now, whether they're having left Russia physically and maybe mentally, do they hold on to a Russian nature with the purpose of preserving it here, with ultimately, like the first wave that shows through this transformation process that it went through in Istanbul, it chose to live out of a suitcase because it or its children or its grandchildren will eventually return to Russia. So it had something to preserve, to give back. And 100 years later, do you think you will preserve that part of Russian culture, which is not what is attacking Ukraine today? For those that yourselves, maybe it might happen, or your children,
Yeah.
or your grandchildren to return to that country. This is the analogy that, of course, I'm trying to establish, and sadly, the answer from many people that I've spoken to, the answer was no.
Mhm.
That there was a complete separation. This is not possible. It's not going to happen. We left. We're not going back. We don't want this anymore. This is not us.
I want back, but not in
Not in this Russia,
this Russia. Yeah.
but this Russia
Russia.
change.
Well,
I love my
possible.
country, but I what they do.
the regime. Yeah. Well, regime supported by a lot of part of the country.
Yes.
All we can do as descendants of the first and second wave, we can keep our history, and we hope it's useful. This is not what obviously was what expected when the first generation left, that we were going to give our knowledge, our history, and our infrastructure to another wave of immigration 100 years later. We thought we would be giving back to Russia. Well, Grisha, there are probably some questions that have
Yes.
accumulated.
Thanks.
Can I turn you back to you?
Yes, of course. So while Timur was speaking, we received a question and regarding Timur, would you be able to elaborate on payments for refugees going to Serbia? For example, who paid, what did they pay for, and for how long?
Yeah, sure. Initial funds came from the consular ambassadors in Paris that basically were officially designated as the organization that have the rights to use these funds deposited in European France, specifically France banks as Russian imperial property. So they use this money to help refugees, and these payments for refugees came initially from this organization, the Council of Ambassadors. But also it was a combination of different funds. These funds, of course, were not enough to cover all the expenses, and different governments, Britain and France and American and charitable funds as well. There are many charitable organizations that help to refugees, but primarily governmental under the redistribution by the League of Nations, Russian Refugee High Commission for Russian Refugees under the Nansen. They collected these funds from different governments and paid the Serbian government. For what they it was the initial installments for receiving refugees to house them. Usually they bought, the governments need to establish camps, tents for housing refugees. Of course, it's food stamps, like food distribution for these refugees, medical expenses as well. So the funds went to the Serbian government to be ready to prepare the ground for refugees who will come. And for what time, the Serbian government demanded like 2 or 3 years installments, and they put the price for every refugees, like starting from like maybe 600 dinars or 400 dinars in different cases, there were different ways, different periods of where refugees were sent to Serbia. But with the negotiation with the sovereign government, the Russian representative managed to reduce these payments to 200 dinars, 300 dinars, and the period was less than 2 years, maybe 10 months. So it was different cases. In different cases, there was different negotiations. But in many cases, and not only Serbian government, but Bulgarian and Romanian and others, they took this money, but many refugees complained in their letters that the government does not pay them for housing. Like, they need to work. It's not just they receive them and they live in these camps. They receive these refugees to have a work, to work in the fields, to, like, I don't know, in mines, as Alexander mentioned, in Bulgaria, permit mines. But these payments should come from these monies, but governments very often didn't pay or didn't pay enough, didn't provide good food, quality food, and it was kind of a way to get kind of make money on these refugees. It's a very vague discussion, and I am comparing different records from different organizations, and they see the disparity and gaps between how much was paid and how much was distributed to refugees. So it's an ongoing research here.
Thank you very much. This question is for either panelists who may or may not know the answer. Are there any sources of ship passenger lists, any manifests from the evacuation from Russia to Constantinople that that people may have access to? Judging by the silence, I'm going to say that that's probably a difficult thing to come by. Okay, Tolia, yeah, you're on mute. Please.
At the Hoover Institution, our service records. Oh, it was muted. Okay. At the Hoover Institution, in General Hrange's papers, we have service records of officers interned at Gallipoli. So that would be kind of the closest that we could come to that. I'm not sure that there are any other passenger lists or manifests that survived, but you never know. Sometimes these things turned up out of nowhere. But as far as I'm aware, we don't have any.
I came across occasionally in the Ottoman archives, there are some lists, not consistent records. It's just occasional documents that show a list of passengers arrived with different ships from everywhere, including from Russia. And it's hard to read, and it's buried somewhere in the different other documents. But occasionally I came across this type of documents, and that's probably the only place where I found it.
Very good, thank you. This question is one for both panelists as well, and perhaps there is no simple answer to this. However, does the Russian Nobility Association have a position as regards the vision of Mother Russia as the third Rome, with a claim on Constantinople as the historic hub of Orthodox faith?
Well, I don't represent the Russian Nobility Association, so maybe the question is best for Alexander.
Well, so you're the historic advisor to the Russian Nobility Association, because no, we don't actually take a position vis-a-vis that. That's not something that we have an official position, but there's certainly there's an historical record there that you could talk about.
Yeah, I mean, that was great maybe for the 14th and 15th century, but we live in the 21st century, and it's better that we remain in the age that we actually live in rather than try to project ourselves into an unknown past and an uncertain future. Let's just live for today and decide that we're probably better off living in reality than trying to create some scheme of Constantinople as a third Rome.
Obviously there was propaganda value to that title, which was adopted by Moscow for the purposes of aggrandizing the Moscow Principality into what became country of Russia. I think has no bearing on present reality.
Great, thank you. This one is actually the most popular question of all so far. Anatole, the question is pretty much directly to you. Where can one purchase or acquire your new book? Someone did a quick internet search and couldn't find it.
Well,
So
that's very kind of you. Yeah, sure. I think it's being sold on Amazon, from the Hoover Institution Press via Amazon. So you can look it up on Amazon, just my last name and the title of the book, or you can just plug that into Google and Google will probably give you, enough responses. But I appreciate that. That's very kind of you, kind of our listeners who want to support the book. Thank you very much.
if anyone has trouble finding it, feel free to send email to RNAA@russiannobility.org, and we will help with that as well.
I was able to buy it very easily on Amazon.
There you go. So Amazon, as for most questions this generation, Amazon is the answer.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Right. Very good. So we have one more question. And again, I think it's pretty straightforward, but I'll ask it. So it's the commenter mentions that it's very interesting to compare the migrations of then to now. And yet support for Vladimir Putin is very, very high. And the question is, are Putin's poll numbers false? I don't know that anyone in our panel has direct access to those poll numbers, but the question remains.
Well, if you accept, as I think most people in the West, the Levadia Center as authentic, and I think it is, the internal poll numbers are probably correct. So the question is why, and I think the answer is propaganda. And
The opposition is in jail.
well, yes, and as Anatole pointed out, the opposition is in jail. But I think it's not even because the opposition is in jail, but that the government control of information sources within Russia is very strong, and they deliver an easily digestible message that carries. So it's a characteristic of most autocratic states that the autocratic leader is a popular leader. You're sitting here today in Istanbul, right between two elections, the election of last Sunday and one that's coming a week and a half from now. And it's a country that's again choosing its future, being autocratic or democratic. We'll see, but it certainly seems that the autocrat is the popular choice.
Well, that does it for the questions that we've received via Zoom. So unless you have any more comments from Istanbul.
Well, no, I'd like to thank our panelists, both our lecturers who have so much knowledge about this, and our recent arrivals to Istanbul who actually had to depart quickly. And I'd like to also encourage everybody to join us in the fall when we will return to the history of the immigration for the purpose of examining its fate, its influence on the evolution of Russia and on the policies of the Allies leading up to and during World War II, and its role in the post-war world, the Cold War, and the end of the USSR. And we'll see if those lessons can be absorbed and put to good use by the present. So I thank everybody for being with us today.
Thank you.
Signing off from Istanbul.
Thank you for this wonderful event.
Thank you, everyone, for joining
Thank
us.
you.
And thank you to our panelists. And I would like to just remind everyone that in a short order, hopefully within a week's time, we will have this recording edited and posted onto our YouTube channel. So a link will be sent out, or rather an email will be sent out with a link to that. And then just to echo Alexander's words, enjoy your summer. And the lecture series will commence once more in the fall. Thank you very much and have a great day. Mhm.